In this video, we will continue practicing working with inverse trig functions, and especially trig functions inside of inverse trig functions, and vice versa. I recommend evaluating the inner function first, and then evaluating the outer function. So first, tangent of 7 pi over 6. Well, the reference angle here is pi over 6. So we've memorized the tangent of pi over 6 is 1 over radical 3, also known as radical 3 over 3. So the only question is this, does this need a negative in front of it? Well, let's think about it. It's not the right one. We're talking about 7 pi over 6 here. So these are pi over 6's. So this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 7 pi over 6 would be right here. Tangent is positive in this quadrant. Alright, tangent is positive here and here. So no, we do not need a negative sign on it. So fine, that's the tangent of 7 pi over 6. Now we need to do the inverse tangent of this. Well, inverse tangent is just an angle. It's the angle whose tangent is 1 over radical 3. And again, we have memorized that the tangent of pi over 6 is 1 over radical 3. So the answer is simply pi over 6. Number 14. Sine of negative pi over 3. Let's do that first. Well, these are pi over 3's. Negative pi over 3 is right here. Sine is negative in this quadrant because it's down. We've memorized that the sine of pi over 3 is radical 3 over 2. So this will be negative radical 3 over 2. Alright, because sine is negative in this quadrant. So now we need to do the inverse cosine of negative radical 3 over 2. Inverse cosine is just an angle. It's the angle whose cosine is negative radical 3 over 2. Now what angle has a cosine of positive radical 3 over 2? Well, we've learned that that is pi over 6. But in this case, that just tells us the reference angle is pi over 6. Okay, maybe I can steal this and bring it over. Okay, the reference angle is pi over 6. But look, all four of these angles have a reference angle of pi over 6. It's just that cosine is positive on the right hand side of the circle and negative on this side of the circle. Now, inverse cosine is only defined for the top half of the circle, though. So for that reason, I can forget about these two down here at the bottom. If I want a negative radical 3 over 2, then I want this one, not this one. Alright, and this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pi over 6. So that's going to be the final answer. It's 5 pi over 6. Number 15. Arc cosine of negative 1/2. Arc cosine is an angle. It's the angle whose cosine is negative 1/2. Now forget the negative for a second. The cosine of what angle is positive 1/2? Hopefully you have memorized that that is pi over 3. Now that is not necessarily the final answer, but that does tell us the reference angle. The reference angle is pi over 3. Now I want negative 1/2, so let's look at a unit circle. Alright, we were talking about pi over 3's. Okay. All four of these angles have a reference angle of pi over 3. But cosine is positive on the right side and negative on the left side. However, inverse cosine is only defined for the top half of the circle because of range restrictions. So I can forget about these two down here at the bottom. Now if I want negative 1/2, I've got to go with this one. Alright, so I can forget about that one. So this is 2 pi over 3, 1, 2. So far I've just done the inner part. Alright, so this angle is 2 pi over 3. Now I have to keep going. I need to know what's the sine of 2 pi over 3. Well, remember, the reference angle is still pi over 3. That hasn't gone anywhere. I know that the sine of pi over 3 is radical 3 over 2. But 2 pi over 3 is right here, like I said. Is this positive or negative? Well, if we're talking about the sine function, sine is positive up here because it's above the x-axis, and sine is the y value on the unit circle. So this should be positive up here, so I'm just going to leave it positive. So this is the answer, number 15. So, inverse tangent is just an angle. It's the angle whose tangent is -1. So what angle has a tangent of -1? Forget the negative sign for a second. What angle has a tangent of 1? Hopefully you've memorized that the answer to that question is pi over 4. Tangent of pi over 4 is 1. That doesn't mean pi over 4 is the answer. It means that pi over 4 is the reference angle. Alright, so the reference angle is pi over 4. Okay, so let's look at pi over 4. Alright, these are pi over 4s. Let me see if I can copy this over. Okay, look. All 4 of these angles have a reference angle of pi over 4. Some of these will have a tangent of 1, and some will be -1. Remember that tangent is positive in this quadrant and this quadrant, and tangent is negative in these 2 quadrants. Okay, also you have to remember that inverse tangent is only defined on the right hand side of the circle. So that means I can forget about these 2 choices on the left. Now if I want -1, that means I need the negative version down here, so I can forget about that. So that means this is the answer right here, and that is negative pi over 4. Now that's not the answer to the whole question. We have just been finding the inner function. This is negative pi over 4. That means now what I have is the cosine of negative pi over 4. Okay, fine. What's the cosine of pi over 4? Ignore the negative for a second. Cosine of pi over 4 is 1 over radical 2, also known as radical 2 over 2. But negative pi over 4 is right here. Is cosine negative or positive over here? Well, cosine is positive on the right hand side of the circle. So this will actually give me positive 1 over radical 2, or radical 2 over 2. So these are the answers. No need for a negative sign. Alright, number 17. Okay. Let's evaluate the sine of 11 pi over 3. Let's look at some pi over 3's. Here are some pi over 3's. Okay. I know that the sine of pi over 3, which is obviously the reference angle, is radical 3 over 2. The only question is, should it be negative radical 3 over 2? Well, let's see. Where is 11 pi over 3? Well, guess what? This is, if I went all the way around, that would be 6 pi over 3. If I went around again, that would be 12 pi over 3. So I'm going to stop one short of that. 11 pi over 3 is right here. sine is a y value. Y values are negative down here, so this should be negative radical 3 over 2. So that was the inner part. So now I have to do the outer part. So now I have the inverse sine of negative radical 3 over 2. Inverse sine is just an angle. It's the angle whose sine is negative radical 3 over 2. Now, what angle has a sine of negative radical 3 over 2? I can't say 11 pi over 3 because I have to respect the restrictions, the range restrictions. I have to stay on the right hand side of the circle. I can't go all the way around doing loops and stuff. Oh no. So what angle has a sine of positive radical 3 over 2? Well, I know that the sine of pi over 3 is positive radical 3 over 2. So that's my reference angle. I guess we already knew that, but so that's my reference angle. But look, all four of these angles have a reference angle of pi over 3. It's just that the sine function is positive in the top and negative in the bottom. So as I mentioned, inverse sine is only defined, hold on, this alarm is telling me to turn my sprinkler off. You don't want to overwater the lawn. Inverse sine is only defined on the right hand side of the circle. Alright, so that means I can forget about these two values on the left. Alright, so it's going to be one of these two angles. But I want a negative radical 3 over 2. Not a positive, so I can forget about this one. So this is going to be the answer right here. And we will go ahead and call this negative pi over 3. Alright, if I go this way, straight to negative pi over 3, I stay within the restricted range. Alright, looking at number 18. The arc cosine of 1/2. Well, that's just an angle. It's the angle whose cosine is 1/2. We have memorized that this is pi over 3. Alright, just straight pi over 3, because the cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2. Alright, so that brings us to the outer function, the sine of pi over 3. Well, we've memorized that this is radical 3 over 2. So nothing fancy there, that's just plain the answer. Okay, inner function, cosine of negative 3 pi over 2. Well, let's look at some pi over 2's. Negative 3 pi over 2 would be like this. I'm going this way because it's negative. 1, 2, 3. Here's negative 3 pi over 2 right here. The coordinates of this point are 0, 1. Cosine is the x value, which is 0. So that tells me that this inner function has a value of 0. So that brings me to the inverse tangent of 0. Inverse tangent is just an angle. It's the angle whose tangent is 0. So what angle has a tangent of 0? Well, remember, tangent is y over x on the unit circle. So for example, this angle right here would not work because that would be 1 over 0. That's undefined. Let's see. So what about this angle right here? This is 1, 0. Y over x, that'd be 0 over 1. 0 over 1 is 0. So that works. And this is actually the angle 0. So the inverse tangent of 0 is 0. So there's one other angle that will also give me 0. This one right here, negative 1, 0. Again, if I did y over x, that's 0 over negative 1, that is also 0. However, I'm not going to pick this one just because of the range restrictions. Inverse tangent can only be on the right hand side of the circle because of restricted range. So forget about this one, even though it also gives you 0. So that's why 0 is the final answer. And last one, number 20. Inverse sine of negative 7 pi over 6. Well, the reference angle is clearly pi over 6. And I've learned that the sine of pi over 6 is 1/2. Question is, should it be negative 1/2? That's all I have to worry about. To be sure about that, I need to look at a unit circle. Okay, negative 7 pi over 6. Well, this would be negative 6 pi over 6. Negative 7 pi over 6 would be right here. The sine function is a y value on the unit circle. Y values are positive above the x-axis, so positive 1/2 is what I want. So that means this inner function here has a value of positive 1/2, which brings me to the outer function, inverse sine of 1/2. Inverse sine is just an angle. It's the angle whose sine is 1/2. So what angle has a sine of 1/2? I'm hoping this is one of the values that you have memorized. The sine of pi over 6 is equal to 1/2. That's why the answer is simply pi over 6. Alright, and that is the answer to number 20. That's going to do it for this video. Just checking. And I hope it was helpful. I will see you on the next video.